Mid-February 1943. The desert around Sidi Bou Zid lay silent under a pale Tunisian sun. The wind carried with it the faint hiss of sand against steel, and the echo of engines that had long gone quiet. There, among the rolling dunes, an American M4A1 Sherman tank came to rest, its once bright white star still faintly visible beneath the freshly brushed-on black cross of the Wehrmacht. Officers of Schwer Panzerabteilung 501 gathered around it, the golden dust of North Africa clinging to their boots, notebooks already open in their gloved hands. This was no ordinary wreck. This tank had not been destroyed or burned. It had been captured intact, still operational. To German eyes, trained to see value in engineering mastery, this was a treasure beyond measure. That single captured tank, one machine named War Daddy II, would quietly ignite a crisis within the heart of German armored engineering. What the Wehrmacht believed it understood about mechanized warfare was about to be rewritten, not by thicker armor or deadlier guns, but by something far more subtle, mechanical endurance, the kind that refuses to break down, the kind the Germans had never truly prioritized. Painted across the Sherman's hull, beneath layers of dust, were the words War Daddy II. Its serial number read USA 3067641, built by Lima Locomotive Works, assigned to Company G, 1st Armored Regiment, 1st Armored Division. A handful of German reconnaissance troops, proud but weary, had driven this American tank across 350 kilometers of punishing terrain, from the battlefields near Sidi Bou Zid to the port city of Sfax. 4.5 days of relentless motion through desert heat and rock and wind. And something remarkable happened on that journey. Every kilometer revealed a small betrayal, not of the tank, but of German assumptions. The engine never faltered. The transmission never stuttered. The final drives, expected to strain under the endless vibration, kept turning with quiet precision. German crews, men who had long grown accustomed to stopping every few hours to repair or cool their own vehicles, found themselves watching in disbelief as this foreign machine just kept going, through grit, through heat, through miles of desolation. It moved as if it had no idea it wasn't supposed to. When War Daddy II finally rolled onto the docks at Sfax, its tracks grinding against the worn planks, it did so under orders that came from the highest levels of German command. The tank was to be shipped north, across the Mediterranean, bound for the proving grounds of Kummersdorf in Brandenburg. It must arrive intact. It must run. The Oberkommando des Heeres had heard scattered reports about American tank production, but numbers on a page meant little. Now they would see the reality with their own eyes, the physical proof of what the American arsenal could do. As the ship bearing War Daddy II made its way northward through restless waters, the Wehrmacht's weapons office prepared their testing protocols. They believed they were about to analyze a simple enemy vehicle. Yet, unknowingly, they were about to confront the very limits of their own philosophy and the industrial might of an opponent they had underestimated. Spring 1943, Kummersdorf Proving Ground, Brandenburg, Germany. A cold breeze carried the scent of oil and pine through the testing fields as War Daddy II rolled off the transport railcar. It now bore a new designation, Zugfahrzeug 259, complete with a German license plate, WH 058941. Around its steel form, a team of test engineers had already been at work, stenciling armor thicknesses and impact angles across its hull. Every measurement, every rivet, every slope was marked with precise white numerals, the language of meticulous inquiry. Kummersdorf, just 25 kilometers south of Berlin, was no ordinary testing site. It was where the German army dissected the future, where captured Allied machines were examined beside their own creations. The air smelled faintly of diesel, hot metal, and ink, the scent of engineering under strain. Here, men with pencils behind their ears and grease on their hands documented every performance figure imaginable. They measured track tension, power output, transmission efficiency, no variable left uncharted. And now, in the middle of that vast workshop of war, stood the Sherman. The Germans were about to conduct the most exhaustive automotive examination they had ever attempted on a captured vehicle. Teams from multiple technical branches surrounded it: powertrain specialists, metallurgists, transmission experts. Cameras clicked in bursts as they photographed every component from every conceivable angle. Measuring instruments traced over clearances, tolerances, gear ratios. They noted something that struck them immediately: the simplicity. The Sherman's construction lacked the delicate intricacy of German engineering. No overcomplication, no excess precision. Everything seemed straightforward, almost crude, yet astonishingly effective. Attention quickly turned to the heart of the machine, its transmission. German powertrain experts crowded around the gearbox, speaking in low, astonished tones. The Wehrmacht's own tanks used straight-cut gears, systems requiring the highest tolerances and constant, careful maintenance. But the Sherman employed herringbone-cut gears, their diagonal teeth interlocking, to share the load across multiple points of contact. It was a design German engineers had long admired, but dismissed as impractical for mass production. Yet here it was, not as an experiment, but as a standard feature. Since the 1930s, American industry had built such systems by the thousands. For the Germans, whose factories demanded near-artisan precision, such production had seemed impossible. To the Americans, it was routine. The first series of tests began. War Daddy II was driven through obstacle. Courses designed to mimic the chaos of battlefields: climbs, dips, dust, and sharp turns. Engineers recorded everything: fuel consumption, engine temperature, gear response. After each trial, the tank was disassembled piece by piece to study wear patterns. Metal surfaces were examined for scarring or stress, filters checked for clogging, lubricants analyzed for breakdown. Each test ended the same way: quiet disbelief, because the results contradicted everything the German tank doctrine had held sacred. The Sherman did not excel in one dramatic category. It simply performed, consistently, predictably, endlessly. Its true weapon was not armor thickness or gun caliber, but the ability to keep moving day after day without the desperate pauses for repair that hounded every German advance. The engineers began to grasp something uncomfortable. This machine embodied a philosophy alien to their own. The Sherman's 5-speed synchronized transmission allowed smooth gear changes without double clutching, a small mechanical mercy, but a revelation to men who had spent years wrestling with stubborn, unforgiving gearboxes. It made the Sherman almost as easy to drive as a civilian car, and that was no accident. The design assumed that ordinary soldiers, mechanics, farmers, truck drivers would operate it. German machines, in contrast, were designed for specialists, for experts, for men who understood that mechanical brilliance came at the cost of fragility. In that difference lay a truth too profound for equations. America's strength was not in complexity, but in accessibility. The Sherman's Continental R975 radial engine, originally an aircraft design, amazed the German evaluators. It tolerated heat, cold, dust, and fuel variations without complaint. Where German engines might seize or fade, the R975 hummed along with steady defiance. Its cooling system, Unremarkable to look at, proved brilliantly efficient. Its air filters, though simple, resisted the choking desert sand that had crippled so many panzers in North Africa. Every component whispered the same message: practicality over perfection. June 6th and 7th, 1943, the artillery range at Hillersleben. Rows of dignitaries arrived beneath a pale summer sky. Among them, Albert Speer, Reich Minister for Armaments, the man personally accountable to Hitler for Germany's war production. Around him, a congregation of generals, engineers, and industrial heads gathered, their polished boots sinking into the dry grass. Engines rumbled in the distance. A demonstration was about to begin. Before them stood an array of armored vehicles, the pride of German engineering, a Panther AOSF, D, a Ferdinand tank destroyer, and sitting quietly beside them, the captured American Sherman, known as War Daddy II. It looked smaller, simpler, almost unassuming. Yet, within that modest silhouette, it held a secret Germany could no longer ignore. The trials began. Each vehicle was driven up steep inclines across trenches through simulated obstacles. Dust rose in heavy clouds. Observers took notes. Some nodded approvingly as the Panther roared past, its engine growling like a caged beast. Others watched in silence as War Daddy II followed, steady and sure, without the drama or the smoke. Speer's face remained unreadable. He needed answers, not patriotic illusions. Germany's war industry was under immense strain, production lines pushed to their limits. What he saw that day at Hillersleben was not a humiliation, but a revelation. The Sherman embodied something Germany could not replicate: the ability to produce thousands of reliable machines, each designed not for mastery, but for momentum. When the engines finally quieted, the dust settled over the field like a shroud. The engineers and officers stood in the fading light, pens still in hand, papers trembling slightly in the wind. They had witnessed not a triumph of design, but a triumph of philosophy, one that would haunt them until the war's end. Somewhere beyond the proving ground, as the last echo of the engines faded into the trees, a single rivet on War Daddy II's hull caught the evening sun, glinting like a memory of something simple, something enduring, that refused to be broken. The Sherman climbed the test slope with a quiet confidence, its tracks pressing into the earth in a steady rhythm that sounded almost like breathing. The 5-speed manual transmission, synchronized from second through fifth, shifted cleanly, each change smooth as a craftsman's hand at work. The engine kept a calm, even tone, a kind of mechanical heartbeat that never faltered during the climb. From his seat, the driver handled the tank as though he'd been born in it, guiding the 30-ton machine with the ease of a farmer steering his plow. That ease, that sense of control, would later become the hallmark of the Sherman name, whispered with both respect and envy across battlefields and boardrooms alike. When the Panther's turn came, the air changed. Its Maybach HL-230 engine roared to life with 700 horsepower, raw, powerful, almost arrogant. On paper, it outmatched the Sherman, but as it clawed up the incline, the difference became clear. The Panther struggled, the gears biting harder, the treads fighting for grip. It reached the summit, yes, but just barely. Each meter gained felt costly, like a beast straining under its own muscle. Then came the Ferdinand, massive, proud, and heavy as a promise, too big to keep. 65 tons of German engineering, powered by a complex electric transmission system that seemed more at home in a laboratory than a battlefield. Halfway up the slope, it hesitated, then stalled. The sound was sudden, brutal in its silence. Crews rushed forward, their shouts lost in the hum of embarrassment. Recovery teams fought to bring it back to life, but nothing stirred. All around, senior officers and industrial leaders watched, and the air was thick with what none of them dared say aloud. Years later, Albert Speer would remember that day. In his memoirs, he described those trials with the tone of a man looking back not just on machines, but on lessons written in steel and smoke. During his inspection tour in Italy, October 1944, he'd seen the Sherman in its natural environment, mud, rock, and mountain. Reports had already spoken highly of its cross-country mobility, yet seeing it with his own eyes was something else entirely. The Sherman climbed slopes that German experts had deemed impossible for tanks. It wasn't just its engine, it was the proportion, the balance between power and weight. A harmony that let it move like a living thing over ground that stopped heavier beasts. Speer, no sentimental man, admitted that the Sherman's mobility on level ground was decidedly superior to that of the German panzers. And coming from the Reich's own armaments minister, that meant something. The 26th Panzer Division had confirmed those same findings, their field reports echoing Speer's reluctant admiration. Within Wehrmacht circles, his words carried weight heavier than armor plate. And soon, those observations reached the public, printed in Das Reich newspaper on June 27, 1943. The article called the Sherman one of the special accomplishments of North American laboratories, a product of the steel industry that combined innovation and precision with a confidence bordering on audacity. It spoke of serial construction and the almost arrogant standards of the American automobile industry, whose demands had shaped the Sherman's character long before it saw battle. There was a curious mixture in that praise, part admiration, part denial. The article mentioned the gyro-stabilized gun, the first of its kind ever attempted, acknowledging a level of American innovation that was impossible to ignore. Yet beneath the formal tone and patriotic rhetoric, there was something else, a tremor of unease. Inside Germany's engineering departments, those public compliments read like quiet alarms, because the truth was dawning. These American machines weren't just functional, they were sustainable, designed for endurance, built for war as it actually was, not as textbooks imagined it. Back at Kummersdorf, the testing grounds became a crucible of revelation. Through that summer and into autumn of 1943, the trials continued. Engineers drove the Shermans across punishing terrain, logging every kilometer, every sound of strain. The results were difficult to ignore. Over 2,000 kilometers before requiring major maintenance, 4 times the operational range of early Panthers under real field conditions. The numbers told their own story. Transmission efficiency that exceeded every German tank tested, power loss through the drivetrain so low it bordered on disbelief. When they examined the Sherman's synchronized transmission, German engineers could hardly believe the simplicity. No need for double clutching, no delicate rev-matching rituals. A soldier with only basic mechanical training could handle it. The final drives, too, were a revelation. While Panther tanks inherited Tiger-style final drives, straight-cut gears that cracked under strain, the Sherman used herringbone gears, an elegant solution that distributed stress more evenly. German frontline mechanics had long complained of Panthers breaking down after marches of barely 100 kilometers. Tanks abandoned not because they'd been defeated, but because their gears had given up. Meanwhile, Shermans rolled on. Decades later, restorers would find final drives still intact, untouched by time, their teeth unmarred by the years. Proof that these machines had been built with margins so generous they'd outlast the war itself. By late 1943, Kummersdorf's reports circulated through the Wehrmacht's technical branches. They were not meant for public eyes. The conclusions were blunt, almost painful. The Sherman embodied an automotive maturity Germany had never achieved, not for lack of intelligence, but for lack of experience. The Americans had spent decades mastering the art of building machines for ordinary people, engines that started on cold mornings, transmissions that anyone could use. The Germans, for all their scientific genius, had built for precision, not practicality. Mass production, so often derided as crude, had proven to be an unexpected strength. American factories could tolerate wider mechanical tolerances, but the result was resilience. Machines that kept going even when the world around them fell apart. Interchangeable parts meant a Sherman could be patched together on the field with a wrench and spare bolts. A damaged gearbox didn't need a specialist. It needed a steady hand and a few minutes' work. For the Wehrmacht, such simplicity was unthinkable. German tanks demanded expert mechanics, factory tools, and time, three things in ever shorter supply as the war dragged on. And yet, these reports didn't just speak of engineering, they spoke of philosophy. The American design wasn't about perfection, it was about purpose. Every bolt, every bearing, was there to serve one idea: keep the machine moving. A tank that fights today is worth more than one that fights beautifully tomorrow. Speer's engineers began to grasp what this meant. America's advantage wasn't merely industrial, it was cultural. Before the war, the U.S. had been a nation of drivers. Cars filled its roads from coast to coast. Mechanics worked in every small town. Boys grew up understanding engines the way others understood soil or seasons. In Germany, cars were luxuries, symbols of privilege. The Volkswagen dream, promised to workers since 1934, had produced fewer than 1,000 vehicles before the war began. And so, when war came, America built tanks the way it had built its cars: simple, durable, human. Germany built tanks. As it built monuments, complex, precise, magnificent, and fragile. That difference bled into every battlefield. By late 1943, field reports could no longer hide the truth. Panthers, for all their power, were mechanical divas, demanding, temperamental, proud. They required strict handling instructions, as if their drivers were caretakers rather than soldiers. Shifting gears too often risked a breakdown. Third gear in particular was notorious. Manuals warned against using it unless absolutely necessary. Reverse turns, forbidden. The transmission simply couldn't take it. Even pivoting in place was risky unless both tracks met equal resistance, a luxury battlefields rarely provided. A single rock lodged in the running gear could immobilize a Panther for hours, and yet these machines were built in specialized factories by skilled hands using the best materials Germany could muster. The irony was as sharp as cold steel: perfection on paper, failure in the field. The Sherman, by contrast, carried no illusions. It was never meant to be the fastest or the most powerful. It was meant to endure, to bring its crew home. And perhaps that's why, when engineers at Kummersdorf stood beside it under the gray autumn sky of 1943, they felt something hard to define, a reluctant respect, tinged with envy. Because the Sherman wasn't just a tank, it was a reflection of a nation that understood machinery as an extension of human will, fallible, repairable, persistent. It moved with a kind of quiet faith in practicality, a belief that reliability itself was a form of strength. And as the last of the tests ended, as engines cooled and the clatter of tools faded into evening, one could almost hear it, the faint ticking of metal contracting in the dusk, the soft sigh of a machine built not for glory, but for endurance. The Sherman, unlike its German counterparts, was not born in secret design offices or under the shadow of monumental egos. It was the child of the American industrial heartland, built not by philosophers of war, but by the hands of automotive engineers from General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler. These were men who had spent decades perfecting the art of reliable motion, the logic of assembly lines, and the language of mass production. When they turned their attention to the battlefield, they brought with them a philosophy shaped not by blood and fire, but by steel, precision, and predictability. The Sherman was, in a way, the extension of America's highways onto the fields of Europe and the Pacific, a machine designed to move, to endure, to be fixed and returned to duty with the rhythm of a factory clock, rather than the whims of a designer's pride. It incorporated commercial automotive components wherever possible, pulling from supply chains that had already been tested in peacetime. The result was not glamorous, but it worked. Its transmission was a symphony of collaboration. Caterpillar Tractor, Buick, and Ford Motor Company, all building to identical specifications, producing parts that could be swapped, mixed, and replaced without adjustment. One Sherman could lend its heart to another without hesitation. It was a language of uniformity, an industrial dialect the American worker knew by heart. This idea, routine in Detroit, remained an almost theoretical dream in Germany. In Panther and Tiger factories, each manufacturer left fingerprints of individuality, subtle differences that made true interchangeability impossible. Where America saw efficiency, Germany saw craftsmanship. But in war, perfection built by hand is often less valuable than reliability built by thousands. As the years turned, through 1943 and 1944, captured Shermans began arriving at Kummersdorf. They came in many forms: vehicles seized from British units in the deserts and hills of Italy, others from the mud-soaked plains of the Eastern Front, where Soviet crews had fought them under the Red Banner. Each was examined, tested, and disassembled under the cold light of German laboratories. Engineers recorded every detail: armor thickness, gear ratios, turret traverse speed, assembling a vast database that, in its quiet precision, revealed the genius of American pragmatism. The German officers were not blind to it. They could feel it, the whisper of industry behind every bolt, the invisible hand of standardization moving unseen across oceans and factories. Some of the Shermans bore strange and powerful modifications. The British had fitted a few with their formidable 17-pounder anti-tank gun, transforming them into the variant known as the Firefly. That long barrel, extending from a turret once thought too small, changed everything. The engineers at Kummersdorf leaned close, tracing their gloved hands along the turret ring. It was wider than most German equivalents, an elegant, almost accidental foresight in the original design. It allowed this larger gun to fit with minimal reworking. That detail fascinated them. The Sherman, they realized, had been designed with room to grow, as though its creators had left space for the unknown battles ahead. The Firefly spoke quietly of adaptability, a word the Panther could never claim. The Panther, rushed into existence to counter the Soviet T-34, was a creature of urgency, not of foresight. Its armor was thick, its gun precise, its silhouette menacing. But inside, its structure left no space for evolution. To mount a bigger weapon or alter its design required a complete rebirth. The Sherman, on the other hand, was flexible, almost forgiving. And as German engineers expanded their tests to include reliability trials simulating battlefield conditions, this difference grew clearer, more damning. The trials were relentless. Engineers drove the captured Shermans across hundreds of kilometers of countryside, through forests, mud, and the skeletal remains of abandoned villages. They noted every incident: a seized bearing, a jammed track, a loose fitting. Every e-hail failure was logged, every repair measured in minutes, not hours. Alongside, reports arrived from the front, data from Panther and Tiger units fighting on the Eastern and Italian fronts. The numbers, when placed side by side, painted a picture no propaganda could conceal. Panther readiness averaged below 40% for most of 1943. Some battalions reported catastrophic lows, 20%, even 25%. There were moments, recorded in weary handwriting, when fewer than 1 in 5 tanks could move or fight. Field commanders wrote of crews stranded miles from the front, engines smoking, transmissions shattered. Even when repaired, those machines limped rather than ran. The Sherman told another story. Across every theater where it fought, Africa, Italy, France, the Pacific, it maintained a much higher operational rate. Even German records, those same documents filled with frustration and mechanical grief, confirmed it. At Kursk, during Operation Citadel, mechanical failures claimed more Panthers than enemy fire. Of all the tanks that began the assault, only 16% were battle-ready by the time the first shots echoed across the steppe. Months passed. Improvements came. December 1943, 37% readiness. February 1944, still 37%. April, 50%. May, 78%. The numbers climbed, yes, but even at their peak, Panther availability never reached what Sherman's achieved fresh from the factory. The trend was unmissable. By late 1943, any honest observer could see the truth. The German machines were beautiful, deadly, and tragically fragile. Engine life told the same tale. The Sherman's diesel variant could endure 3,000 kilometers, with proper care. A quiet testament to Detroit's precision. Panthers, even with improved engines, barely reached 1,000. Reports from March 1944 proudly claimed that the new models could survive 700 to 1,000 kilometers. It was described as an achievement, yet it represented barely 1/3 of the Sherman's endurance. Then came the transmissions. In a Sherman, gears meshed with easy grace, synchronized, forgiving, almost intuitive. A young driver could learn quickly without fear of breaking the machine. But the Panther was temperamental. Its gearbox demanded constant attention. Third gear failures became so common that drivers simply skipped it, leaping from second to fourth as though that number had been cursed. Each mile carried a question. Would it hold this time? The final drives told the cruelest truth. Sherman drives endured. Panther drives disintegrated. German units found their own machines crippled within a mere 100 or 200 kilometers. And then came the irony, the humbling, almost painful irony. Field reports began describing German units using captured Shermans in active service. Not as curiosities, not for training, but in combat, because they worked. Unlike the Soviet T-34s, which German mechanics heavily modified before putting them to use, Shermans required no such effort. They rolled from American hands into German ones without complaint, without a single fundamental flaw to correct. They started when turned on. They moved when commanded. They did what they were designed to do. Crews who had spent months nursing unreliable Panthers now found themselves behind controls that simply obeyed. In letters home, those few that survived, they described it as almost uncanny. It feels trustworthy, one wrote. Reports from panzer regiments carried the same refrain. Sherman operators could think about tactics, about the mission itself. Panther and Tiger crews, by contrast, spent every march listening for new noises, praying not to stall before reaching the fight. It was a small difference, perhaps, but in war, small differences decide fates. In January 1945, during Operation Nordwind, The 10th SS Panzer Division captured 12 M4A3 Shermans near Hatton and Hagenheim. They had belonged to the American 43rd Tank Battalion, abandoned intact amid the chaos of retreat. The Germans didn't scrap them. They didn't study them. They used them. Formed into the 13th Company of the 10th SS Panzer Regiment, these tanks served in battle until the final months of the war. They became reconnaissance vehicles, mobile reserves, roles demanding endurance over glamour, reliability over pride. Commanders soon recognized what the men at Kummersdorf had known for years: an American tank could be trusted to function when needed. That single fact, dependability, was what mattered most when the front collapsed, when every liter of fuel in every working machine meant survival. A Sherman that arrived at the battlefield, gun ready and engine humming, was worth more than a Panther stranded 20 kilometers behind, its might undone by its own complexity. By January 1944, as Wehrmacht forces withdrew across collapsing fronts, the testing at Kummersdorf expanded further. More captured variants arrived, each adding another layer to the understanding of this American creation. Engineers studied the M4A1 with its Continental R975 radial engine, smooth, compact, a relic of aviation design now adapted for the ground. They examined the M4A2, its twin General Motors 6046 diesels running with the steady pulse of a factory floor, fuel efficient and disciplined. They tested the M4A3 with the Ford GAA V8, a gasoline engine admired by American crews as the heart of the best Sherman ever made. Different hearts, different rhythms, but all beating with the same dependable spirit. In the end, every variant, no matter its engine, no matter its configuration, demonstrated the same truth. The Sherman was not a miracle of engineering brilliance. It was something rarer. It was a triumph of foresight, of practicality, of faith in systems that worked quietly rather than dramatically. And that, perhaps, was its secret power. In the stillness of the Kummersdorf proving ground, when the last engine shut down and the air cooled, there remained only the faint ticking of metal, contracting with the cold. That sound, small, rhythmic, alive, was the echo of reliability itself, the heartbeat of a machine that refused to quit. The German engineers at Kummersdorf had seen many machines by 1944, each one a testament to a nation's pride, its desperation, its genius or folly. But the Shermans, lined up in their foreign, almost casual uniformity, stood apart. What struck them first was not firepower, nor armor thickness, but something quieter, steadier. It was the way each bolt, each weld, each fitting looked the same no matter which variant they examined. This consistency, this rhythm of repetition, felt alien to men accustomed to variation between factories that in theory built identical vehicles. To the Germans, raised on the gospel of craftsmanship and precision, the idea that uniformity could be a form of excellence was unsettling. The Sherman's reliability was not an accident of luck. It was the offspring of sound engineering principles, married to disciplined manufacturing, a product of a nation that knew how to make machines run and keep them running. The diesel-powered M4A2 particularly caught their attention. These models, sent to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease, over 4,000 of them, had trickled back westward in German hands as the tide of war reversed. Each one was a reluctant messenger from Detroit and Flint, crossing front lines and ideologies alike. The twin General Motors 6046 diesel engines, humming with the low, even rhythm of efficiency, performed every bit as well as their gasoline cousins, yet consumed far less fuel. In 1944, as the German war machine starved for every drop of synthetic gasoline, that fact carried a kind of bitter poetry. Here was a tank that not only fought well, it sipped fuel like a careful soldier conserving rations in winter. German designers had once flirted with diesel power years earlier. The concept appealed to their engineering minds, more efficient, safer, cooler running. But they had abandoned it, undone by manufacturing complexity, by the delicate choreography of fuel injection systems, by the sheer difficulty of production under wartime pressure. The Americans, however, had achieved what Germany could only theorize. In their vast, orderly factories, diesel and gasoline Shermans rolled off the lines side by side. No chaos, no lost time. It was a quiet display of flexibility, of an industrial machine so vast and adaptable that it could absorb change without faltering. That alone spoke volumes about the difference between the two nations' wartime realities. By March 1944, reports from General Heinz Guderian, Inspector General of Panzer Troops, tried to sound optimistic. He noted in official communications that Panther reliability had, at last, reached what he called acceptable standards. Engines could now survive 700, even 1,000 kilometers. Final drive problems, long the bane of his armored divisions, were said to be largely corrected. The tone was one of restrained triumph, the kind of forced optimism that lives between the lines of military bureaucracy. But behind the polished phrasing lay a truth hard to celebrate. These improvements merely brought the Panther to the level the Sherman had reached in 1942. It was a bitter irony, one few dared to speak aloud. The Wehrmacht now praised as progress what had been the American starting point, and as these reports circulated, Allied bombers drew their contrails high above German skies, tracing the slow collapse of an empire built on overcomplication. Strategic bombing struck not at the front, but at the heart, at the arteries of production. In April 1944, the Royal Air Force launched a devastating raid on the Maybach engine plant in Friedrichshafen. 322 aircraft swept through the night, dropping their burdens with relentless precision. The attack, later chronicled in the archives of the Imperial War Museum, crippled German tank production more completely than any battle ever could. The factory that built the Panther's beating heart was left in ruins, and with it, the ZF gearbox plant beside it. For 6 long months, no Panther engine turned, no transmission left the assembly line, and when the smoke finally cleared and production resumed that November, the machines that emerged bore the marks of exhaustion, of sabotage, of despair. German industry, now fueled by forced labor, began to consume itself. Prisoners and enslaved workers, torn from occupied lands, stood at the lathes, their silent defiance etched into every flawed gasket and jammed oil passage. A cigarette filter pressed into a bearing channel, a bolt left half-threaded, a small act, invisible, yet deliberate. Every whisper of rebellion cost the Reich another tank that would never run. None of this touched the factories across the Atlantic. In America, the plants were bright, warm, alive. Men and women worked in shifts, well-fed, well-paid, proud of their contribution. The clang of metal echoed through clean halls, the smell of oil and hot steel mixed with coffee and cigarette smoke. It wasn't utopia, but it was stable, motivated, human. That was the real difference between the Sherman and the Panther, not the theories of design, but the worlds that built them. German engineers were no less brilliant. They understood automotive science as deeply as their American counterparts, sometimes more so. But theory without standardization becomes chaos. Their tanks were powerful, yes, but obsessed with the wrong virtues. They worshipped firepower and armor, the numbers that dazzled generals and impressed Hitler himself. Yet all that strength rested on engines that broke, transmissions that failed, and powertrains that strained under too much weight. The Panther's mighty 75mm KWK-42 gun and thick frontal armor came at a punishing cost, a 45-ton machine whose drive system was stretched to its breaking point. The Tiger, that great behemoth of Yassi legend, demanded constant maintenance, expert care, and a small army of mechanics to keep it breathing. Had Germany possessed endless resources, perhaps it might have worked. But by 1944, the bombs fell heavier, the steel ran thinner, and the oil was gone. Across the ocean, American factories thrived on rhythm and repetition. Engineers trained in the automotive world had long since mastered efficiency. They built tanks that could be produced by the tens of thousands, maintained by farm boys and mechanics who had never seen Europe before they landed there. The Sherman's design philosophy was brutally simple: make it easy to build, easy to repair, easy to drive. Its powertrain borrowed from proven commercial systems. Even its electrical design carried civilian wisdom, like a backup generator that could power the turret traverse even when the main engine stopped. To German engineers, that sounded like unnecessary luxury. But to the men inside a Sherman, fighting on a slope or idling in ambush, it could mean the difference between survival and silence. Many German crews had known the helpless feeling of sitting in a stalled tank, their turret frozen as enemy shells approached. In that moment, luxury becomes salvation. By the spring of 1944, the cracks in the German war machine had widened beyond repair. Reports flowed in from every front: Panther final drives failing after 100 kilometers, engines seizing mid-march, gearboxes shattered by stress. Spare parts vanished into shortages. Replacements never came. Commanders issued orders forbidding long road movements for fear their tanks would never reach the fight. Panthers had to be transported by rail, caged beasts too fragile to run. Even the Berge Panther, designed to rescue disabled panthers, shared their flaws. It broke down on the way to recover the very machines it was meant to save. By then, some reports claimed that 70% of German tank losses came not from enemy fire, but from mechanical failure. The myth of the indestructible Panzer was dissolving in the dust of its own tracks. Meanwhile, on the other side of the ocean, the factories kept singing. 49,324 Sherman tanks, an ocean of armor, rolled out before war's end. More than all German tank production combined. The British and Commonwealth received thousands. The Soviet Union, over 4,000 diesel M4A2s. Even Chinese forces in Burma wielded Shermans to devastating effect, their American engines roaring through jungles where Japanese tanks, obsolete and fragile, stood no chance. Every battlefield, every front, told the same story the engineers at Kummersdorf had already written in their ledgers. Properly maintained, the Sherman simply kept going. It was not the strongest, nor the fastest, nor the most glamorous, but it endured. And in war, endurance is victory disguised as humility. Letters and post-war reports from German tank crews who had served in captured Shermans spoke with a kind of reluctant admiration. They wrote of engines that started easily, transmissions that shifted smoothly, and systems that worked without constant attention. Even the complex Chrysler A57 multi-bank engine, 5 engines working as one, was easier to maintain than the German Maybachs that demanded specialized tools and fragile patience. In those reflections, long after the smoke had cleared, there was no bitterness, only recognition. Beneath the pride and the ruin, the men who had lived through it all understood. The Sherman was not a marvel of brilliance. It was the triumph of discipline, of practicality, of a nation that built machines the way it built hope, steady, constant, and meant to last. And somewhere, in the silence of an abandoned testing ground, The wind moved through an open hatch of a captured Sherman, whispering faintly through the empty steel shell as if the machine itself was still breathing. Then came the winter of 1944, the Ardennes, Germany's last gamble, the 150th Panzer Brigade, a strange, desperate creation. Men in stolen uniforms, vehicles repainted to look American. A plan born of deception, not strength. Their commanders demanded captured Shermans for the operation, not for disguise alone, but because, deep down, they knew. Only American machines could be trusted to go the distance behind enemy lines. But when the day came, they received just two. Only one of them even worked. And in the freezing chaos of the bulge, choked roads, broken bridges, endless traffic, that one Sherman never saw battle. It sat, idling in the snow, waiting for orders that never came. The ultimate irony. German troops relying on American reliability, and still stranded by their own logistical collapse. January 23, 1945, Berlin. A meeting of the Panzer Commission, the final reckoning. Before them lay the numbers, stark, merciless. 500 defective final drives in the Panzer IV, 370 in the Panther, 100 in the Tiger. Even the Hetzer, the humble tank destroyer, reported 200 failures. General Wolfgang Thomel, Chief of Staff under Guderian, put it plainly. In such circumstances, orderly utilization of tanks is impossible. Impossible. Morale collapsed. Crews began to abandon their vehicles, not because of fear of battle, but fear of being stranded, surrounded, captured. They no longer trusted the machines built to embody German might. The tanks that once symbolized terror had become liabilities, and in the final months of the Reich, steel confidence turned to dust. At Kummersdorf, the great proving ground of German armor, the war was ending. Soviet guns were approaching from the east, each shell a punctuation mark on the death sentence of the Third Reich. In the workshops, engineers worked through the night. They packed documents, drawings, test results, anything that might survive. Trains left under cover of darkness, bound for the west. Among the chaos, a few captured Shermans, the same tanks that had once been dissected and studied, were pressed into service. Desperate hands welded German crosses over American stars, and in those last ragged days, Shermans and Panthers fought side by side against the red tide. One eyewitness later wrote, "The Shermans ran until they burned. The Panthers stopped long before that. When fuel ran out, they were abandoned. The Panthers, mostly from failure, the Shermans, from exhaustion." In the ruins of Berlin, the machines stood side by side, one built for glory, the other for endurance. Both silenced by a war that demanded too much from both. The story of War Daddy the Seine and the other Shermans, tested at Kummersdorf, is more than a technical report. It is a mirror, showing two civilizations in metal and motion. On one side, German engineers, brilliant, meticulous, trapped in a system that prized perfection over practicality. They built machines that looked magnificent on paper, elegant lines, powerful guns, ingenious mechanisms. But in war, those machines could not keep their promises. On the other side, American engineers, pragmatic, disciplined by decades of automotive production. They built not art, but endurance. They accepted imperfection, so long as it worked every time it was needed. And that made all the difference. When the Allies examined destroyed German tanks after the war, they confirmed what Kummersdorf had already whispered. Mechanical failure was as common a killer as enemy fire. Final drives shattered from stress. Transmissions seized for lack of lubrication. Engines overheated, burned out, starved of oil. They found perfection in pieces. German tanks demanded devotion, precision, faith. But the men who fought in them were exhausted, half-trained, short on tools, short on parts, short on time. They could not serve these machines as they required. The Sherman, by contrast, forgave mistakes. It let ordinary soldiers do extraordinary things. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't invincible. But it was there, again and again, wherever it was needed. Kummersdorf was overrun in April 1945. What remained of its archives would later inform West German tank design, quieter, more efficient, grounded in reliability rather than spectacle. The lesson had been written in steel and smoke. Perfection had failed. Reliability had won. In the end, it wasn't the roar of the mightiest engines, nor the brilliance of their blueprints that decided the war. It was the steady hum of the engines that wouldn't quit, the quiet rhythm of 1,000 Shermans, rolling on, grainy film flickers, post-war Germany. Smoke still rises from shattered cities. Amid the ruins, engineers return to their drawing boards, not in triumph, but in reckoning. When the Federal Republic of Germany began developing the Leopard 1 main battle tank in the 1950s, its designers faced a silent mandate born from catastrophe. Never again would engineering brilliance collapse under its own perfectionism. Black and white photographs fade into blueprints labeled Leopard Versuch 1, 1956. They studied American automotive engineering with reverence, examining not the might of the Sherman's gun, but the quiet wisdom of its engine mounts, its transmission ratios, its ease of maintenance. The new German design would be light, mobile, and above all, reliable. The Leopard 1 emerged from this new philosophy, function over fascination, a powertrain robust yet forgiving, components standardized, easily replaced in the field, ample design margins built in, not as waste, but as resilience. The Leopard 1 would become one of the most successful tanks of the Cold War, serving from Canada to Chile, Belgium to Brazil, a machine born from the memory of failure and from lessons written in the ashes of Kummersdorf. That captured Sherman, its name still painted in white on olive drab steel, had become more than a test object. It was a teacher, silent, patient, and irrefutable. To the German technicians of Kummersdorf, War Daddy 2 was proof of a cruel truth, that industrial maturity mattered more than technological genius. Every bolt they tightened, every kilometer they logged, every maintenance cycle they recorded, each confirmed the same conclusion. America hadn't built a marvel. It had built a machine that worked. The engineers who had once worshipped complexity began to see beauty in simplicity, in generous tolerances, in forgiving systems, in machines designed to serve soldiers, not to challenge them. German engineers had pursued the dream of absolute superiority, thicker armor, longer guns, higher velocity. They believed that if the tank was perfect, it could overcome any numerical disadvantage. They were wrong. The Americans understood something deeper, that wars are not won by the best machine on paper, but by the machine that keeps moving when the paper burns. Reliability, not glamour, became the true currency of victory. By 1944, the difference was statistical and fatal. For every German tank operational, the Allies had 3. For every hour a Sherman spent under repair, a Panther might require 3 days. Operational availability, not armor thickness, determined who advanced and who retreated. A Sherman with a 75mm gun that reached the battlefield was worth more than a Panther that never left the depot. A battalion with 80% readiness could execute an offensive. One with 40% could only wait for its own destruction. Numbers had become destiny, and reliability had become strategy. Germany entered the war with superior science, but insufficient industry. The United States entered with ordinary machines, but extraordinary factories. The American system transformed civilian production into military power almost overnight. Where Germany hand-built a few masterpieces, America mass-produced excellence at scale, with interchangeable parts, modular siege, systems and process discipline refined through decades of competition. Nearly 50,000 Shermans rolled from those lines, as many as every German tank combined, and still the United States produced aircraft, ships, trucks, rifles, and food, enough not only for itself, but for its allies. That was not luck. It was infrastructure as strategy, reliability not just of machines, but of an entire nation's rhythm. By 1945, the outcome was no longer tactical. It was arithmetic. Germany could no longer build enough machines to replace those that failed. Each breakdown became a miniature surrender, one tank at a time. The math was merciless. 5 working Shermans beat one magnificent Panther that would not start. Even the most elite panzer divisions, once symbols of unstoppable power, became shadows of their former strength. Half their vehicles sat silent, drained, waiting for parts that would never come. Orderly utilization of tanks was simply impossible. That single line from the Panzer Commission's final report marked the death certificate of the German armored force. 500 defective final drives in Panzer IVs, 370 in Panthers, 100 in Tigers. Every failure another nail in the coffin of perfection. Kummersdorf prepared for evacuation. Among the files, the test logs of War Daddy. 2. Readings of oil pressure, temperature, vibration, endurance. Data that would survive the war, traveling westward, later studied by Allied intelligence. In those pages lay a quiet confession that the enemy's strength had never been in the thickness of his armor, but in the steadiness of his design. When West Germany rearmed under NATO, the new generation of engineers carried the weight of Kummersdorf in their notebooks. The Leopard 1 was not a weapon of intimidation. It was a promise of maturity. It could be repaired in the field, maintained by ordinary mechanics, and upgraded without tearing apart its soul. From the ruins of defeat, Germany had rediscovered humility, and through it, regained excellence. The story of War Daddy 2 is not merely mechanical, it is philosophical. It asks every engineer, every commander, every nation, what truly wins a war? Is it the pursuit of perfection or the mastery of function? Germany built for superiority. America built for endurance. And endurance, in the end, endured. War Daddy 2's endurance became a metaphor for industrial civilization itself, a symbol that technological strength means little without logistical resilience, that even genius must bow to the discipline of production. Every kilometer that Sherman drove at Kummersdorf was a quiet declaration of American philosophy. Build it simple. Build it strong. Build it to last. To the Germans who tested it, War Daddy 2 became a haunting reminder of defeat. To history, it stands as proof that victory often hides in the mundane, in bolts that don't shear, engines that start, and steel that forgives. It was an unremarkable tank, one among thousands. But in its unremarkable endurance lay the quiet truth that decided a world war. From Kummersdorf to Koblenz, from War Daddy 2 to Leopard 1, the lineage is not of defeat, but of learning. It is the story of how nations grow wise, when they learn to build not for pride, but for permanence. In the end, victory belonged not to perfection, but to persistence.